Live from our hurricane headquarters with real-time analysis from some of the nation's top meteorologists, this is Tracking the Tropics, powered by Bose Electric.
Welcome to Tracking the Tropics. Unfortunately, we have a lot to talk about this week, but the good news is it looks like even if everything develops, nothing would be serious, and that is highly, highly unlikely. And so welcome to this edition of Tracking the Tropics. I'm meteorologist Rebecca Berry. We have Amanda Holly, our normal host, is on vacation, hopefully catching really, really big fish, as we know she loves to do. We do have a guest meteorologist joining us right now. I'm going to welcome in WGNO's Brantley Keek. And did I say your name right? I just blanked on it.
Yeah.
Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your tropical experience and what you think about this season?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Pensacola, Florida, and hurricanes are actually what inspired me to go into being a meteorologist, as are with many meteorologists on the Gulf Coast and East Coast. Hurricanes, Ivan and Dennis, back when I was growing up, really inspired me to pursue this career. So I'm really passionate about the tropics. I am a little concerned about this season just because of the active season we're expecting. But again, it's important to just remember it's just one storm that it takes to impact your community. So, of course, we're hoping for the best here, but we'll be keeping a very close eye on everything that develops.
Absolutely. And I feel like most of us thought that with such warm sea surface temperatures and the later transition to the La Nina weather pattern, we certainly would have been a little busier than we are by now. But luckily, we haven't been. It's been one of the quieter starts to the season in the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, it has been pretty quiet, especially for the last several seasons. We've seen some really early storms that start up in late May even or into early June. But this one is actually kind of closer to our usual start for the storms. Usually the first named storm is around the middle or end of June. So this one's a little bit more normal, but it might be abnormal for us now after having so many busy seasons.
Exactly. It's hard to remember what's normal. And I feel like this tropical season's being a little nice to us in that sense because it's somewhat easing us into the tropics. Let's talk about these two areas that we're watching for development right here. We've got two areas that we're watching for development, and I'm going to make it a little wider here so we can see both of them. One of them is over in the Gulf, and one of them is way out in the Atlantic. And so both of these systems have a relatively low chance to develop in terms of what we're seeing out there. And so we're not looking for anything to become rapidly intensifying or anything like that. We'll start with the system that's out in the Atlantic. Brantley, I'm sure you're watching this one.
Yeah, we have been watching that one for a few days now. We've actually seen that chance of formation go down some. So it was at 30%. Now we're back down to 20%. And it is just a very broad swirl there and really not a lot of organization. We've seen more storm activity firing up today on the satellite imagery, but we really haven't seen it get that much more organized. So this really could be an issue for rip currents along the east coast of Florida, Georgia, into the Carolinas. But as it stands right now, it doesn't look like this will really be anything too impactful. Of course, if that changes, though, we'll have to talk about that more in the future. But that chance of formation has gone down, so that is some good news for people there on the East Coast.
And we love to see the chance of formation go down. And we also love to see much needed beneficial rain head in places that we really needed. And Florida has been pretty dry. We're looking at least abnormally dry conditions, if not drought conditions, across a lot of the areas. Now, this is kind of the one to watch. I think this one will probably end up being our first named storm. What do you think?
Yeah, I think Alberto is likely to be the first named one with this one. It might take a little bit of time for it to get organized here as we've been watching it sort of meander around the Bay of Campeche, the southwestern Gulf for a few days, but it is slowly getting organized. And then that next system that we're talking about after this one, looking like it could form in the same area as well. So we might get Alberto and possibly Beryl later on.
Back to
Yeah.
back. And Mexico could not need that cooling rain more. If you think about the record heat from a couple of weeks ago, they were talking about monkeys dying and falling out of trees from heat stroke. This could be some really beneficial rain if it's spaced out enough for Mexico and parts of Texas as well.
Yeah, they're going to get a lot of beneficial rain, especially after being under that heat dome for so long. I'm sure that many people are going to be enjoying the cooler temperatures that come with this. And for people in southern Texas, many people there are in some sort of a drought, whether it's abnormally dry or, a moderate drought. This rain will be beneficial for them too. But of course, that does come with the flooding concern. When you are in a drought, sometimes the soil can't hold as much water. So that is something to watch out for.
Yeah, too much rain too fast is equally as devastating as not getting any of the rain. And now this is one of the designations that came out a couple of years ago that people tend to get a little confused about. It's potential tropical cyclone 1. And in other words, this is not a tropical storm. This is not a tropical depression. This is just a broad, basically a South Central American gyre has entered the Gulf, and that will take a long time for it to tighten up. But because it is so close to land, they created this designation purely for this reason, because they needed to issue watches and warnings for areas that may be feeling the impacts within 48 hours, even though it hasn't actually formed yet. So this is a bit of a technicality, but this is how they get around that technicality with that potential tropical cyclone 1 designation. And so if you play out the forecast cone from the National Hurricane Center, they do expect it to become a very weak tropical storm before landfall just north of Tampico and south of Brownsville, Texas. And that's Wednesday into Thursday before basically dissipating back into a low pressure system and that much needed rain that Brantley was talking about just a moment ago.
Yeah, I think some people get hung up on the word cyclone when we talk about potential tropical cyclone. I think a great substitution is to say potential tropical threat, or potential tropical system. I think people get kind of hung up on the wording there sometimes, but really they just give this designation to say, hey, we might have something spin up very quickly when it's close to shore, so we're going to go ahead and issue these watches, warnings, these advisories, so that you can be prepared for the impacts. And looking at the key messages today from the Hurricane Center and their latest advisory, the very first one says, don't focus too much on the track because this is such a broad, expansive system. The impacts are really going to be felt pretty far away from where we see landfall, all the way up towards Louisiana and even a little bit farther south there in Mexico.
Couldn't agree more, and I may be stealing that potential tropical threat from you if you don't mind.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Imitation the sincerest form of flattery. And so much needed rain headed there. The spaghetti models agree, so we don't expect any wild changes or any wild risks than this. Sometimes when spaghetti models are this boring, I feel like we should come up with another name for them, because this is not the spaghetti models of the 90s where it actually looked like spaghetti on the plate. These are models that are agreeing this is where the system's headed.
Yeah, the models have gotten a lot better over the years, and we have seen more often than not that they are in consensus. I think now it's almost it's an anomaly whenever they're not. So
We love to have consensus, though. It gives us the ability to do our job a little bit better. And this is just kind of a broad overview of the rainfall that we could expect, some of the heaviest around 4 inches. Now, this does not take into account what sometimes weaker tropical systems do, which is big chunks of it sort of break off because it's not well organized, because that rain's not evenly distributed around that stronger center of low pressure system. Sometimes you get rain that just sits in areas, and that's when we really have to worry about flooding.
yeah, I mean, even here in New Orleans, we've seen some tropical downpours over the past couple of days, and we really haven't seen, a consistent heavy rainfall. But as it's typical with tropical systems, we have these bands of rain that come through, and some spots may see way more than others that are just a few miles away. It all really depends on where those bands set up and how they train over the same areas and who sees the slower moving storm cells compared to those that might just see a very brief shower.
Exactly. And sometimes I hate to see those weaker systems head our way because of the inland flooding threat. And New Orleans is a perfect example of being susceptible to inland flooding, especially due to rainfall as well.
Oh yeah, you have the rainfall flooding concerns, especially for us here in New Orleans. We're below sea level and we have to pump that water out. But on top of that, when you have the water, eventually it has to come downstream too. So that also renews river flooding concerns as well.
And now this is a broad overview of the system that may develop in the Atlantic. And it is, while you did point out more thunderstorms, and this is the most thunderstorms we've seen out of it, it is still just not looking impressive. Seems to be a lot of wind shear out there as well.
Yeah, we've had a lot of wind shear across that portion of the Atlantic and stretching into the northern Gulf of Mexico. And I think that's been part of what has kept this season, being so calm at the start for us, and it's really helped us out here. I do know that we've been watching some of these models, and that wind shear is forecast to start moving away, some start to dissipate a little bit in the coming days, but so far it's been helping us out quite a bit.
And I just want to point out to anyone that's watching, especially on our Facebook feed, if you want to ask Brantley or I a question, for us to see your comment, use the hashtags just below our names there. If you use the hashtag #HeyRebecca or hashtag #HeyBrantley, we'll be able to see your comments, pull them in, and potentially put them on the screen, just like this one. And so reminder to use that hashtag if you'd like to ask either of us a question. We can answer it for you here live and get you the information that you need. And this one coming from Chuck Andrews on our WFLA Facebook page. Hashtag Hey Rebecca, will this bring any rain to Florida? And the good news is we do expect it to bring some rain to Florida. I know Miami's going, no, 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 not us, please, because they have gotten so much flooding rain lately. But it looks like anywhere along the East Coast could probably expect an inch of rain. And then closer to northeastern Florida, Jacksonville, St. Augustine, Palm Coast, all the way up to Brunswick, even into the South Carolina, possibly some hot spots there in purple getting 2 inches of rain. And it all has to do with that weaker system, basically, where the rain sets up and trains in. And unfortunately, it can be feast or famine. You can get tons of rain in your backyard and your neighbors don't get much at all in these types of scenarios.
Yeah, it's really hard to communicate that sometimes too, that, we have the rain chances, but it really could be very different just across town or just even in your own neighborhood sometimes.
And this is a great question coming in from Andrea, and I'm going to send this over to Brantley. She says, I don't see an eye or spin. How can it be anything but a nasty storm?
And that is part of one of the reasons why, Andrea, why we have seen this thing be called a potential tropical cyclone, because we haven't had that low-level circulation close off yet, where we really have to have that low-level circulation close off and have a closed area of low pressure in order for it to be designated as a tropical depression or tropical storm. So until we can see that circulation, like we might not see a clear eye with this one because it's such a messy storm, but until we can see the winds really close off and have that circulation, it's going to continue to be called a potential tropical cyclone. And it really is just a sloppy rainmaker at this point. We may see it get a little bit tighter and more organized over the next 24 to 36 hours before it moves onshore, but I really wouldn't expect this to be anything more than a weak tropical storm. But again, those impacts can go far away from the center. We're really talking about rain being the main impact here.
I feel like with both systems, it's beneficial rain headed towards areas that need it the most. What we really have to watch out for is that flooding concern. I think that's probably going to be the biggest headlines from either of these systems, whether they develop or whether they don't.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's easy to get hung up on the naming here, but the impacts are what we should really be focused on. The rain and the flooding concerns are going to be the main thing.
We've got another great question coming in. It's hashtag Hey Rebecca. I thought La Nina would push the storms to the west, not the east. Are we in La Nina yet or still in between? And so what's going on with us right now is we are transitioning from El Nino to La Nina. And with El Nino, we typically see the stronger wind shear over the Atlantic that keeps things quiet. La Nina, we don't get that wind shear, and that leaves the Atlantic open for kind of ripe for the picking without the wind shear. And I think I do have a tropical wind shear graphic here we can pull up and kind of look at where the wind shear is. And just to refresh your memory, wind shear are high upper level winds that cut the tops of storms off. So they're not able to form. They're not able to intensify. They're not able to continue to thrive out there. And so the areas in red is where we have the heaviest wind shear. And you can see where our potential tropical cyclone 1 is over along the Gulf, pretty low wind shear. And then the areas in the Atlantic that this other system may be entering, whether it becomes a system or whether it doesn't have much wind shear either. And so when we have that low wind shear, that's when we look for basically prime conditions for systems to form. And moving into the weekend, we get even less wind shear. So it does look like things would become more and more favorable over the Gulf and over the Atlantic as well.
Yeah, absolutely. As soon as that wind shear starts to dissipate some, it's easier for those storms to stack vertically and get stronger. But when we don't have that wind shear, it kind of blows the tops off of storms. They stay a little bit weaker and they're more susceptible to falling apart.
And then we always love our GFS versus Euro comparisons here on Tracking the Tropics. I feel like everyone that really invests in the tropics has a favorite, the GFS versus the Euro. Do you have one, Brantley?
I go back and forth. I would say like this one right now, the European has been my favorite so far. I think it's been pretty consistent. The GFS in the long run, though, is usually one that I prefer more.
I see. We call it a GFS-icane here, like about 10 days out. It always makes a hurricane about 10 days out. So if you're going on vacation as a meteorologist, you're watching that and hope it's not a real hurricane.
Absolutely, yeah.
The Euro does show that secondary development in the Gulf, though, that we were talking about, basically in the same area that potential tropical cyclone 1 is. They show a very broad circulation over the weekend. So it does look like there is the potential for, just like you mentioned earlier, Alberto, bam, Beryl, bam.
Yeah, that Central American gyre we talk about is pretty typical for the early part and the end of the hurricane season. It's just, that very broad spin there around Central America and Mexico, and that eventually, if it spins long enough, something can break off and spin a little bit faster in the Gulf, or we can see it tighten up and turn into a depression or storm. So it's pretty typical for us to see this pattern play out. But, it'll be interesting to see if it plays out back to back in the same, 7 days or so.
And then I was also watching the GFS because yesterday it did have a tight circulation, or at least a circulation form for the system over along the East Coast. But this model run, I'm not really seeing it on the GFS. It shows the same Alberto possible barrel in the Gulf, but there's just not much circulation with that system by Thursday off the coast of northeastern Florida. It's more of a ridge than it is a circulation. So I'm not sure that if that's going to affect formation chances going down even further.
Yeah, it might. So, again, like we were talking about with the models, it's important not to just focus on one model run. We have to watch for the trends over time here. We see a few model runs and see if we see these trends holding for a few runs or a few days, and that gives us a better idea of what to expect. Just looking at, what might happen one time is really, something that can be kind of random in one of these runs. But we'll have to keep watching that GFS model and see how it plays out.
And we've got another question. Remember, if you want to ask us a question for us to be able to see your question, you need to use our hashtags, hashtag Hey Brantley or hashtag Hey Rebecca. And this one's hashtag Hey Brantley. What makes the storm heading towards Mexico a tropical cyclone versus a tropical storm? And this is just what you were talking about earlier, Brantley.
Yeah, so a potential tropical cyclone, earlier I was saying it might be easier to think of it as a potential tropical threat. A cyclone is anything that is a tropical depression, a tropical storm, or a hurricane. All of those things are considered tropical cyclones. So calling this a potential tropical cyclone, it's saying we may see this develop into something that's a little bit stronger, whether it be a depression, a storm, or a hurricane, at which point it would get a name. But until then, we're calling this a potential tropical cyclone because it hasn't quite closed off that circulation yet, which is required for it to get the name. But it's getting very close, and we could see it very quickly tighten up and get that name very close to landfall. And because of that, you want to have the advisories, the watches, and warnings out ahead of time so people know about the potential impacts. With wind here, the potential impacts are pretty minimal. We're looking at winds of 40 to maybe 50 miles an hour, gust possibly a little bit higher. But the main impact here is going to be heavy rainfall, possibly some mudslides in Mexico, and possibly some flash flooding concerns and renewed river flooding concerns in Texas.
That's right. And so that's what we're watching out there. I do want to point out, as we're kind of winding this episode down, unless we start to get some more great questions like those, we do have very abnormally warm sea surface temperatures. And that's really what a lot of the long-term forecast models have focused on. And I just wanted to point out where the warmest waters are. It's right where the two systems may develop, over along the coastline of Mexico and Texas. And then you see that the Gulf Stream over in Florida, on the east coast of Florida, and there's a big warm water eddy there right off the coast of southeastern Georgia and northeastern Florida. And so we watch those for the potential for rapid intensification, especially. But I just don't see that in this case because it takes those systems that come off the Central American gyre so long to tighten up. And then the other system that we're watching in the Atlantic's battling so much shear in between now and when it does reach the warm water. I'm not really thinking this is going to be one of those situations.
Yeah, there's a lot of potential fuel there for a storm to develop, but I don't think that these are the right candidates to use that fuel to really rapidly intensify, like you were saying. And unfortunately, with a weaker system, we don't see that cold water upwelling that we would typically see with a stronger storm. Sometimes when you see a hurricane that pushes through or a strong tropical storm, you can kind of see that trail of colder water coming up behind it. But it takes a decent strength for a storm to create that, and we're not really going to see that with these ones. So I think that water might stay pretty warm for a long time here.
Yeah, we were hoping that as messy as it's going to be over the Gulf over the next couple of days, maybe the rain would help cool it off and just the cloud cover itself. And that will be minimal, but it will be nothing like if a powerful system were to come through and create those upwellings where it basically drags the cooler water up from the depths of the ocean and starts to dissipate that warmer water. So it's not going to be the solution, but it may help, especially the Keys out where the water's a little shallower and we're worried about the coral reef there.
The coral, yeah.
Yeah, beneficial rain for the Gulf is what we really need right now. And we do have one more question coming in right now. It's hashtag Hey Rebecca. What kind of weather are we looking at in Texas? And we did kind of brush over this earlier, but I'll go ahead and load you the rainfall map we were talking about. Because what we're looking at in Texas right now is some beneficial rain. Now, most of it's to the south of Houston, like it doesn't make it up to Dallas, but this is a broad overview. And so what's unpredictable about particularly weak systems like the one we're tracking, potential tropical cyclone 1, you can see how disorganized it is. When you're looking at a classic storm, you've got that rain evenly distributed around the eye, and powerful systems with a lower low pressure system and a higher strength can wrap that rain around this system system. And so this will end up being rather lopsided. And lopsided means some people get a ton of rain and some people get almost no rain. And so right now it looks like most of the rain is going to be on the northern end of the system as it makes its way onshore, which would mean heavier rainfalls for Texas as opposed to the south or center of rotation. But this is going to be one of those wait and see games as to who gets what amounts of rain. And it really is going to aid. The National Hurricane Center this year is focusing on inland flooding from rain in hurricanes. And so this will be another case study for the products that they're testing out and the messaging that they're testing out for that inland flooding, because it does appear to be a continual threat and something that we need to possibly message differently so that people understand what they're up against over inland areas. A lot of times people that live inland don't necessarily pay as much attention as those that live along the coastline because they don't think it can flood in their neighborhood because they are so far inland. But especially with weak rainmaker systems like this, I am worried about the potential for inland flooding.
Yeah, a lot of people focus on the wind impacts, especially those that are right along the coast, because that's where the wind is strongest when a hurricane makes landfall. But water has always been what causes more deaths, more damage from storms, and that can spread very far inland, not just along the coast. We had that storm surge threat on the coast sometimes with the stronger storms, especially, but rainfall flooding, which can linger for several days, especially with a very slow moving system. If you think back to things like Hurricane Harvey, where they saw a lot of heavy rain over the course of a few days, things like that can really change how impactful a storm is. So again, it's important just to focus individually with each storm what the impacts are going to be, and not just think, oh, this one's a tropical storm or this one's a category 2. And think that what the impacts are going to be based on the category. But you really have to focus each storm, how it's going to play out, because it could be very different, especially for those that might be in a drought, like we were saying earlier. They might see more flooding than those that have seen a decent amount of rain and their soil can hold more moisture.
And so, in summary, we're watching two systems that may develop, but they do not have high chances to develop. In the Gulf, that first system that we're watching is more likely to develop than the other. It would, if it would take the first named storm of the season, which would be Alberto, but both forecast models, the GFS and the Euro, do show a second formation in the Gulf in the exact same area with what looks like the exact same intensity, which is pretty weak, which could take the name Beryl. We're also watching an area moving towards the East Coast that may be a rainmaker for northeastern Florida. And I'm going to leave you with final thoughts on what's out there and what you can expect for the season, Brantley.
I'm really not expecting these systems that we're watching right now to be too impactful. I do think that the rainfall flooding and the river flooding for Texas might be impactful for those there in southern Texas, especially those that have been seeing drought conditions. But these are not going to be the strongest storms that we see this season by far. I think these will be some of the weaker ones. And looking ahead to the season, I do think that it will become more active. I know we are expecting La Nina to start taking hold more by August into September and October, which of course is the peak of hurricane season. So that does, concern people some more, especially when we expect those warmer sea surface temperatures that are already very hot across the Atlantic basin. We've seen near record or record sea surface temperatures. So there's a lot of fuel out there heading into the season. And unfortunately, these weaker systems aren't going to take much of that heat content out of the ocean. We'll see, like Rebecca said, some relief there with the rainfall on the surface, and the extra cloud cover, of course, helps keep things a little bit cooler. But those impacts might be a little bit too brief for us to really get any reprieve here from the long-term heat that we're seeing in the ocean out there in the Atlantic basin. So with the warm sea surface temperatures and La Nina coming up later this season, I think it's important everyone stays prepared and stays very vigilant, especially as we get into August, September, and October. But for now, I think it is typical that we see some of the weaker storms early on in the season compared to what we see in the heart of the hurricane season.
That's right. And we're going to leave you with a picture of where we typically see development this month, which is exactly where we're seeing the potential for development. So it's kind of a textbook season so far, starting up exactly when it's supposed to, even though it feels early for us because we've had such busy seasons over the last couple of years, and also seeing formation in basically exactly where we typically expected in the Gulf and then right over along the East Coast near northeastern Florida all the way up to the Carolinas. So hoping this textbook season stays quiet for us, although we do not expect that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And thank you so much for joining us, Brantley. We want to remind you to get your information from meteorologists like Brantley and like myself. There's a lot of stuff flying around the internet just to scare you and just to get clicks. And whenever, especially a storm is threatening your neighborhood, we'd like you to rely on your local meteorologists.
Yeah, absolutely. Always get your information from a trusted source.
And thanks again so much, Brantley. I'm going to start our sign off this afternoon. And so we are watching those two potential systems. If we do get any designations, we will hop right back here on Tracking the Tropics and let you know of any changes that we've seen, if they're flying any recon missions through these systems to get a better idea of if they are actually forming, if that low is actually closing and that circulation is starting. But right now it looks like both systems are not likely to develop, but whether they develop or whether they don't, they are expected to bring beneficial rainfall to Texas and Mexico and possibly even northeastern Florida and southeastern Georgia. Signing off for this week of Tracking the Tropics, I'm meteorologist Rebecca Berry. Make it a great week.
Find Tracking the Tropics on these platforms and for storm